Okay, we'll make a start. I expect a few people might join a little bit later. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our first online seminar as part of the Horizons in STEM Higher Education Network. And you can see it's going to be presented by Jane Pritchard, who's currently the Head of Educational Development at the University of Oxford. She has a STEM background, so she's made that transition. And that's going to be on supporting personal development of teaching-focused academics, so a key focus of our network. And we're particularly going to be looking at evaluation and pedagogic research within the STEM disciplines. And before we go on, I just take this opportunity to say a little bit about the network, since it's our first seminar. And thank you for signing up to be part of this network. And just to remind you of the aims of this network, one is to build that should we say, community of scholarship of teaching and learning practitioners. And that, as a consequence of that, when we run these seminars, we're going to be trying to make them interactive. So even in today's seminar, you'll be expected to do a little bit of work, and Jane will be sending us out into breakout rooms to get us feedback and discuss things. And the second two aims here, you can see the third one is promote and support best practice in evaluation and pedagogic research, and the seminar is focused on that. And we'll have other seminars that perhaps support that. But the other theme of the seminars will be providing opportunity for members of the network to share their good practice in teaching, learning, and assessment. And this is very much following on from our conference in recognition that actually not everybody can attend and present their work and listen to work by attending residential conferences. And the version of free online seminars gives a wider spectrum of people an opportunity to disseminate their practice and get greater recognition. And hopefully out of all these seminars and also the conference is to foster collaboration across institutions. So in terms of pedagogic research and other innovations, they often have a lot more impact if they involve people from different institutions. And out of our conference series, we've already had people from different universities combine to be involved in different research projects or innovations. So I think that's something we'd like to grow. So before we start, asked just some details about the Zoom setup. Just to remind you that only registered participants can actually access the seminar. Just highlight that the host does have control, so they can mute people, turn people's videos off, and control who can share the screen and the chat function. But as it stands, the chat function will be open. We do ask you to mute your microphone as usual, because there's a lot of people on this call. And generally, we encourage you to leave your video on, but perhaps that's particularly important when we go into the breakout rooms. Not perhaps so important when somebody's presenting, but actually when in the breakout rooms, it's also always much more interactive where you can see people's faces. And the final thing is to note the seminar has been recorded, and we do hope to produce some sort of output from this seminar. And I'm not sure how that's disseminated, but we will be disseminated amongst attendees, because actually one thing we're trying to get out of this seminar is, what support can the network give for people starting off or want to develop further their pedagogic research, and that might well then inform our future ideas for seminars and so forth. So I'm now going to hand over to Jane, but just before we do that, we have a sort of outline program. We're going to be quite flexible with that. I think Jane would like to introduce some activity in a mini breakout room within her presentation. So that might take a little bit longer, and we might have a slightly less time for the subsequent sessions. But I will now hand over to Jane and stop sharing my screen.
It's really helpful. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me along. It's great to be with you today to talk a little bit about pedagogic research, to talk about SOTL, to talk about all these things. And Neil, Alice, thank you very much for the invitation. As Neil said, I was a former 20th century, I always say, the material scientist and engineer. So I broke an awful lot of wood to make my PhD, like hundreds and hundreds of pieces of wood. And I spent most of my science and engineering career trying to predict the future of the fewest amount of data points I could get. moving into, not consciously moving into educational activity, because I never wanted to be a teacher. I had to learn a whole new culture around respect for different types of data. Okay, so that's been a huge shift, and I spent a long time over the last 2 decades working particularly with STEM academics in realizing the superpower you bring to educational inquiry around research design, and I want you to hold on to that as we go through today's conversation. Okay. And if you've ever been to anything I ever do, I love penguins, so they're always going to feature. Okay, so that's why penguins are here today. You never see a penguin having a bad day. Okay. So let's do this. I'll share the slide deck afterwards as well. I'm going to start a little bit with something from Parker Palmer. And if you haven't come across this, he's written a book, I wrote it quite a few years ago, around the courage to teach. And I think this is really important that we think about courage at this stage in our conversation, because you're taking a courage to be an educational researcher. And he talks in the beginning of the book about the growth of any craft. And I've highlighted craft because I don't like teaching and educational research to be a craft. I think that's a sort of belittles it a bit. Depends on shared practice and honest dialogue among the people who do it. We grow by trial and error, to be sure, but our willingness to try and fail as individuals is severely limited when we are not supported by a community that encourages such risks. So Neil started by the introduction of this is the community. Take risks. And I would say I've been editing journals and reviewing papers, particularly in STEM sort of educational research, for a long time now. Everything seems to work all the time for everyone, which is an amazing outcome. Okay, so I think sharing our failures is just as important as sharing our successes. Okay, so that's the first place I'd like to start. But I'm going to ask you to spend a couple of minutes. You've got a Padlet link, which Alice has just, in a DJ fashion, put in the chat. Just focus on the first question. Don't go answering the other ones. We're going to give you plenty of time for those. What are you passionate to investigate in teaching and learning in higher education today? And I recognise some of you may be very experienced pedagogic researchers already, and some of you are completely new to this. So just take one moment. What are you passionate to investigate in teaching and learning today? Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to go onto the Padlet and add your point there. Don't forget the Padlet's anonymous. Okay, all right. There's a nice question in there about fieldwork. There's some great research on the fieldwork. If anybody's ever read the Journal of Geography in Higher Education, there's some brilliant work in there about fieldwork. That's really good for biological subjects as well. So have a look in that journal. Okay, we're going to pause that and I'm going to carry on, but it's great to see all the range of interests that you all have. All right. We're thinking about in this talk a little bit about how to get started and recognizing some of you are further along that trajectory. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the language. So we've got evaluation, pedagogic research, scholarship of teaching and learning, and I'm going to give you my tuppence worth on what the point of all these different words is. Okay, if that's helpful. I'm a huge advocate for the scholarship of teaching and learning, mostly because it's not a thing, it's a philosophy. Okay, and people talk about SOTL as an object too much, particularly if you read a lot of the North American literature. And about 5 or 6 years ago, as part of a big study trying to make a definition of scholarship of teaching and learning, and apart from the fact we couldn't agree who went first on the definition if we were going to be cited it, we decided it was a pointless activity. And we meant that because people get themselves caught up in knots. And scholarship of teaching and learning for me is a philosophy, is a way of approaching higher education. It's about having evidence-based, evidence-informed decision-making about educational activity. Okay, evidence-based, evidence-formed, which normally starts from a heartfelt or a feeling. And the bit that I always think is missing in a lot of decision making in higher education or trying to understand it is people mistake my feeling and personal experience for evidence. So how do we take a feeling, something we're passionate about or interested in, and turn that into something where we collect data and find out whether it's true or not true, or why it's happening, and explore it as a proper researcher. And that for me is the strength that I think good evidence brings to it. So scholarship of teaching and learning is an umbrella term about how we do practice in educational activity. Lots of things are written, but I've gone back to my old favourite of Lee Shulman because it's very simple. Okay, and I'm going to show you this. They say that to characterise something as subtle under this umbrella, so it involves all sort of activities. You should be going public. So today you're starting to talk to colleagues, sharing your practice, and the levels at which you do that will change. It might be in your department, it might be in your university, it might be at a conference. What you do should be accessible for exchange and use by others in one scholarly community. So you've already got the community here. You're starting to use things from other ideas, other disciplines, other subjects, other institutions. And it's open to critical review and evaluation. So you're putting it out there to see whether people believe you, trust what you're saying works with the data you provide. So that's the part of that. And that's just good research, isn't it? There's nothing different. That's how SOTL's defined. Pedagogic research or educational research is systematic and sustained inquiry, planned and self-critical, which is subjected to public criticism and empirical tests where those are appropriate. Research is educational to the extent that it can be related to the practice of education. I don't see an awful lot of difference between these. Okay, so if you're wondering, am I doing pedagogic research? Or am I doing SOTL, etc.? My answer is it's all the same. It's just scales of influence and reach. Evaluation's a tiny bit different. So evaluation is something you tend to do for yourself with no need to go public. So it might be you've run some feedback surveys at the end of a class. You might be doing some internal evaluation for the department, but its focus is inwards rather than outwards. But SOTL and PEDAR, don't worry about it. But the main thing that characterises all of these is their purposeful activity. Okay? So purposeful activity is the main characteristic, and it's what distinguishes good pedagogic research, good activity in the scholarship of teaching and learning from what I'd call more show and tell activity. Okay. And I'll go back to the show and tell because it's got its place. So often people have done some really exciting teaching. They've had a fabulous activity, or they did this, they introduced I'll go back to my old friend interpretive dance into lab teaching in organic chemistry, and it went amazingly well. And they share that story with their colleagues at faculty or university conference or nationally. That's not pedagogic research, but it is great sharing of practice. And it does count under the scholarship of teaching and learning because you're sharing. But to make it purposeful activity, you want to know why it was great, or why it didn't work. I so often hear when I talk to academics, I tried that group work thing, Jane, you told me about. It didn't work, so I'm not doing it again. Now, as somebody who comes from a lab-based subject in my previous role, never ever did I go to a lab, something didn't work and leave and think I'm never going back in again. Okay? And normally I went back in and worked out why it didn't work. You have a kind of a curiosity. So that curiosity still stands, and I want you to hold on to that, okay? So purposeful activity normally stemming from something that went particularly well or particularly not well. Okay, that's why I asked you about your passion. And some things around AI, it's got an opportunity and challenge, and people are on different areas of that. There's some questions in the Padlet around trying to understand more about the awarding gaps. What is going on there? These are kind of really curious questions. We're not just trying to fix them, we're trying to understand what's going on. Okay. So the link between this bit and good research design is also going to link us into the publication bit, okay? Because most often, and for anybody else who reviews papers for any of the kind of educational kind of focused journals, my feedback is more often 9 times out of 10 because the research design has not been in place. So getting this right helps produce a good shareable publication. And nothing I'm going to say, hopefully, looks foreign to any of you. You need a good research question or hypothesis. You need to position your question in the learning and teaching and higher education literature. You need some clear methods and how you've analysed it, some results, a discussion, some conclusions that links to your literature, and some way you're thinking about sharing your project. Now, if everything I said you think, well, that sounds obvious, I'm going to tell you I'm saying it because I say it 90% of the time. Okay. More importantly, the bit I think that I'd like us to focus on is the first bit, the research question and the literature. Okay. Sometimes you might have read something and you're thinking that's interesting. Sometimes you might have an idea and you haven't read the literature. So a lot of times I see people starting out in this area and they'll say something like, I'm the first person ever to think about group work in organic chemistry, and I'm going to do a project about that. I said, well, are you truly the first person in organic chemistry, or are you the first person in your university? People have been doing group work in engineering for decades and decades and written millions of things about what makes it work, what doesn't make it work. So making sure you're understanding what your niche is really important. Okay. So this bit, this cycle around the literature and your question is the bit I think is where all good research design stems from. And in your subject areas, you know that. The struggle can be is you're less familiar about where to go looking for that literature in the educational arena. Okay. And that's where your network comes in. Okay. And then the thing we spend a lot of time doing is triangulating. Is there a justifiable relationship between your question, the data you think you need, and the methods of collecting your data? Okay, so far, I hope you're all thinking, that sounds very sensible. That sounds like what we do all the time. Just apply it to education. Okay. I am going to ask you also, you're going to have to manage some of your own expectations, okay? It's really important to think about who's affected, your reach and impact. We think about reach and impact a lot in sort of subject-specific research. It matters as well, I think, in SOTL and PEDAR inquiry. Is think who's affected by the work. Is this something I'm doing for my course, my department, my faculty, division, whatever construct you have? Or is it something I'm trying to contribute to the professional body around physics teaching for IOP or something? So who's affected by the work? Reach and impact, and what changes as a result, the so what. Okay, so reach and impact also have a bearing on how big a project you're able to do. Okay. We're going to do the steps, and I'm going to give you some chance to talk to each other. So there's some steps, and you see lots of things written around this. And I've tried to break this down to how I was taught this 20-something years ago, okay? And don't forget, I was coming into this sort of new area of educational inquiry, and it is about a respect for a slightly different culture of research, but it isn't about losing everything that you've learned, okay? And I think that's the bit I had to manage the most, okay? So what idea are you interested in? So we've got some ideas on the Padlet. You've got some areas you might be interested in. What's already been done in this area? So we keep talking about cycling around. What have you read about? What's convinced you? What's not convinced you in the literature? What major outcomes, dependent variable, are you interested in, and independent variable? And this matters because we're going to work through writing a question, okay? Are you looking for differences or a relationship? Who do you want to apply your results to? And what exactly is your research question? Okay. What answer to your question do you expect to find, your hypothesis? And why does the question matter? So questions around AI, awarding gaps, there's a huge relevance today. They're the kind of things that are impacting us, things about supporting neurodivergent students, thinking about how we're creating a more inclusive anticipatory curriculum. These are important, meaty questions, aren't they? So they're the steps, and we're going to work through this a little bit. So where to start? So I said earlier, you may start with, I've just taught something, it's gone particularly well or not so well. I wonder why. And that's a great place and a really good point to make a purposeful inquiry, okay? Looking at the Padlet, you've got things, you might be trying to create a more inclusive anticipatory curriculum from the outset. You might be somebody whose role is supporting a lot of individual adjustments to support students in the program, and you're thinking there are a couple of things here that perhaps we've got structural inequities in the program design that we should be designing out from the first place, but what are they and how are they manifesting? That's a great, slightly more complex project, but a good one as well. And we're starting to change the scale of the types of projects you're doing. We might want to understand the awarding gap in your subject. So, you know, you might want to understand, why is it that boys consistently do better than girls in maths undergraduate degrees in my university? And or you might look across and find that it's a pattern across the sector. Okay, that's crude, but we know there are some clear and defined gender awarding gaps, and we've all got the access and participation plans in the English sector to respond to. So where to start? A passion and an idea, something you've experienced, or something that's going on strategically within your area and subject. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes in some breakout rooms in 2s or 3s, and I think someone's going to do this, to think about what's the first thing you do when you have an idea about a project. Okay, so take 3 or 4 minutes with your colleagues. If you could put your cameras on for your colleagues just to say hi. What's the first thing you do when you have an idea about a project? So if we could send people off into breakout rooms, that'd be fabulous. Or do you want me to do it? Great.
I think it's
okay. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, everyone. We'll come back to some of this as well. And I guess projects is just a phrase for kind of some bit of inquiry you're going to do. I'm a big fan of using sort of educational inquiry as well. I also find pedagogic a problematic word, mostly because most people might spend ages tripping over saying it. But that's my other rant. Yeah, thank you. And it's great to see the additions to the chat. So it's nice to see and share that. So thank you, everyone. So where do we start? We start from all different places. So in the room I was in, we were talking about reading. Hang on. I'm just going to go back. Have you taught? Something's gone particularly well. I've lost my blah, blah. So we start with reading. And all the question, and there's a lot of that, or sometimes it's a response. Okay, I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking about how we might create any of those contexts into a decent question. Okay, and I want to show you and try and take you through something. It's a little bit difficult to do this, but I wanted to show you something I've spent a lot of time typically with people working through, and this is a great time to go and find a friend, a critical friend who's going to really work with you on this. So no matter what your context is, creating and crafting a decent inquiry question, and I've used that as our kind of common language, is the superpower that's going to unlock a really good design, no matter what your time frame is. This is also something I think which lends itself much better to coffee, cake, and large pieces of paper. Okay, so generally speaking, this is a good sort of social pens, paper exercise. So I want to start with a question. I was digging around looking for examples of research questions or inquiry questions that we typically see. Do students using peer review in chemistry courses increase their mastery of quantitative problem solving? So this is one that's been out there, and it may seem usable, but it's got a couple of things that are going on in it that are a little bit problematic. Okay, so the first thing in writing and doing good questions is to try and write open questions. Okay, so do questions yes or no, and that doesn't really lead us to much, do it? So writing open questions is the first thing to do. Okay, I'm going to try and rank this through. There's a few things is we're going to vary, and we're going to start funneling this question down. And how far we funnel will depend on our time, resource, motivation, etc. Okay, so who are the students? Okay, what do we mean by peer review? Chemistry courses seems quite big. There's increased their mastery. There's some assumptions made in there. Okay, and quantitative problem solving. Right. So peer review is the independent variable. We think that peer review has an impact on students' mastery of quantitative problem solving, okay? And we're looking to prove that slightly. And it's been really, in a really good research design, and we all know this, we've got to be able to hear no as well. But the question is setting ourselves up in a skewed way. So we start to refine this, and we change this into a what ways. Okay, what are the features of peer review? that in chemistry courses help students increase their mastery of quantitative problem solving. Let's try again. Increase their mastery and peer review have been linked, haven't they? What we want to know is what role, potentially, does peer review have on chemistry courses, the impact on students, okay, without any assertion on it. It doesn't necessarily it's going to increase or anything. And then we come into what data does peer review in chemistry courses impact students' quantitative problem solving? Let's remove the mastery. Because I'm going to ask, if you can't tell me what the definition of mastery of quantitative problem solving is, you've already set yourself up for a slight problem, okay? So in what ways does peer review in chemistry courses impact students' quantitative problem solving skills? We'll go again, because you've only got a limited time and you've got the rest of your life to lead, okay? In what ways does peer review in third-year chemistry courses impact students' quantitative problem solving? Now you started to identify who the focus is of the study rather than all students. But maybe you haven't got all this time and you actually want to know in the third year colour chemistry module what impact peer review may have. Okay, and you can keep going and keep going. But the job of your critical friend is to work out what the most important thing. Have you made a link that peer review has a link to problem solving? And how are you going to isolate and work out whether it's just the peer review in your course, or is it the fact that in Derek's course, he did a phenomenal amount of analytical problem solving that actually helped them. It just so happened your two courses happened at once. Okay. So a lot of questions treat students, I think, sometimes like they're in isolated boxes or in fume cupboards was the only way I could think of analysing it. And actually they're experiencing lots of other bits of education. The whole way you might be interested in a bigger study is understanding what are the factors that contribute to students developing quantitative problem skills, solving skills in chemistry. And that's a much more open question because there may be things which are completely out of the formal curriculum that are helping them. Okay. It's a tricky thing to try and show, but the point is it's trying to show that every question you start with is not the beginning. You're going to go down a long piece of paper and you're going to start to identify lots of things about who are actually the students you're interested in, what is the potential assumption you're making. And I always suggest to people on their big pieces of paper to write a column, like take the paper and make a quarter of it, put a big line down your big piece of paper and what assumptions you're making. That we can define mastery of quantitative problem solving. So in social scientists areas, when I work with social scientists, they're all trying to help students develop their critical thinking skills. Okay. If you do a Google search on critical thinking skills, in less than 0.0000 seconds, you get 1 million hits because there's no definition of it. So the fact that you're going to say, I hope my lectures improve students' critical thinking skills is fanciful. Okay. But if we want to try and understand how students develop some aspect of their knowledge or skills development, it's about focusing on what's possible. Your third year students, your second year students, etc. So principles there, okay? But this bit matters and give it the time it deserves, okay? And I think this is why I'm trying to emphasize this. So reading literature, and sometimes in the literature and in reviewing journal papers, I spend a lot of time kicking back and going, what was your question? What was the actual question you're trying to answer? And they often don't have one. And it causes the studies to come undone. I said, writing a good piece of research takes time, big pieces of paper, coffee, patience, and someone else. Okay. I really think it's not a time for sitting on your own. I really think it's a time to get someone to almost interview you about your question and develop that. No matter what your motivation is for the study. You may find that your question will lend itself to what you might call a qualitative or quantitative method or a mixed methods approach. And I'm going to caution here that particularly people sometimes jump to the way I'm going to find out my answer before they've really thought about the question they want to have. So you may have already decided that you're going to do a pre and post survey and you're going to do you're going to look at the exam results. You've already decided the data before you've actually decided the question. Okay, and I hear that quite a lot. So I'm just saying that you may not do that, but just be careful and just be aware if you're doing it, okay? So don't let the method dictate the question or be a slave to the method you've used a lot. So you may be very familiar with doing surveys. Surveys is one way to do something, and there are many types of surveys, as we know. But here's the bit where we have to appreciate that most educational questions need some qualitative data. In fact, they're probably predominantly qualitatively answered problems or inquiries rather than quantitative. Okay, so you may need and may find it useful to use some numbers to assure colleagues who are not in this area of your findings, but invariably, in my experience, the numbers, all they do is put a lot of numbers on things, but don't tell you any answers. Okay, so I've seen a lot of statistical analysis done of some students' outcomes when actually it's got no relevance to the initial question. So a classic and a very low bar one is, are my lectures effective? I've looked at my lectures and I've seen the students' exam results, and I've done a p-value. I've done every statistical test I know, and the students do better after my lectures. Therefore, and it's statistically proven, my lectures actually help students do well. It's not true. Okay, but the stats on those papers is phenomenal. Okay, so be careful, okay? And embracing qualitative research is the thing I had to learn the most. And I can tell you, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. And doing it well is hard. Doing it poorly is blooming easy. Okay. For now, keep on your question. Don't get into I'm going to do a date. Don't get into the data collection, okay? Your next move is to think about how you're going to collect your data. What data do you need? Okay, so what is the data that's going to help you? So in our question about the peer review, we really want to hear what students are doing in their study that's helping them develop their problem-solving skills. We want to hear what students articulate, don't we? I wonder if students know what they would define quantitative problem-solving skills as in the first place. So we need to hear from students, don't we? We might need to hear from staff what quantitative problem skills means. And then we need to understand what it is about peer review that might be contributing to that. I don't need to know about the exam results. That might be a bit of a result I might have, and it might be part of the data. But the data I need to hear from students. Okay. Lots of the reading would have given you some clues about how to approach this. And you're constantly, probably, mostly, going to be doing some mix of quantitative and qualitative. There's a lot of mixed methods research out there because it gives confidence and it's comfortable. You may also do something where it's very small data sets. Okay, and people get worried. I've only got 5 or 6 students. I haven't saturated the population. You're not trying to predict the future. You're trying to make sense of what's going on in that context at that moment in time. You're trying to understand things to share with people rather than make proof. And that's quite a switch to make. Okay, as someone who went from hundreds and thousands of pieces of data, sometimes down to 12, it was quite a leap of faith. But you're just trying to make sense of the data you have. Okay. So embrace some different ways of collecting data and different methods. We talk a lot about validity and reliability. You'll see more in educational inquiry about credibility and trustworthiness. Is what I'm saying credible compared, is my question right? Is the data I've collected helping me answer my question? Have I analysed it and not made any interpretations? And when I share my story with Neil or Derek or Vital or Alice, they think that's that was right. You didn't make any assertions in there beyond your data. So you're not claiming beyond your data set. It's trustworthiness and credibility. Okay, that's just the importance, all right? Now, you're going to have read a lot of journal papers and a lot of articles where you just don't believe what you read because there's a lot of poor research out there. Okay, and that's the shame. Okay. So don't believe just because it's been published. If you read it, you think, I just don't believe that, then it's not trustworthy. But if you don't believe it because it's not got 100,000 population points, that's a different thing. Okay. What you do when you're actually analysing the results in education inquiry is also part of the scholarship. Okay. So that's an important thing to think about, okay? You're also bringing your intellect and analysis to the data as much in qualitative research as you are in disciplinary research. You're going to go public with your findings, and you can't go early enough with some peers to kind of sense it, particularly around trustworthiness and credibility. So when I got into this, I used to work with somebody who was a geneticist, and we did our first piece of work. We interviewed 14 PhD students and PhD supervisors in pairs. I did the interviewing, I did the analysis, I did what I thought was my categorization, gave it to her to look at, and she had to see if she could repeat and get the same categories out of the data set. It took us 6 months, okay, to actually agree on the findings from that data set, not 6 days, but to agree that. And she agreed as a geneticist and me as a material scientist that it would have been great just to have had numbers. Okay, but it was to get a data set we trusted and felt was resilient. Took some real work. We got faster, I'm telling you, but at the beginning it took a long time. Share your findings and your research design, and share it all, not just the successes, okay? I'm going to ask you to do something in your research, and it's great to see on the Padlet about asking difficult questions. Ask difficult questions because there's lots of things out there that are causing us stress. Don't just focus on satisfaction, effectiveness, etc. Ask the things that are really tricky about supporting students around the use of AI, the challenge it presents to the institution, awarding gaps. These are things, access and participation. These are big questions, and sometimes really challenge how much interaction is inclusive and appropriate to our subject area. We need to have good, compelling stories to tell about our teaching and learning. Compelling as in trustworthy and credible, okay? Not just shiny and lots of penguins, okay? It's a whistle-stop tour through a big area, but I want you to take away, I hope, that research design matters. Spending time and attention at the beginning of any project, whatever time and scale you have, whatever boundaries you've got, to think about the focus of the inquiry, the topic, the hypothesis, and any assumptions you've made, and how you're going to hear the negative in the data. That you're not just looking for confirmation bias, okay? I'm going to give you some time in your groups, and I think they're going to bring you up in bigger groups to start to think about what things enable you to engage in pedagogic research and what are the barriers. Don't worry about the Padlet, okay? You're just going to do it in discussion, and the facilitator in the room is going to try and capture some of it onto the Padlet. Can I hand back to you to do that now?
I'll come back, Harry. Just wait a minute or two just to see if there's any other people coming back. I think probably got everybody back. So, thanks, Harry, because actually we've got quite a few things on the Padlet for enablers for pedagogical research and barriers for pedagogical research. And I think we will be looking at that as a network because that will inform what we can do going forward. But I just wondered, I'm not going to ask every group, but is anybody from one of the groups want to feedback, one barrier to pedagogical research that's not time? Because I think everybody puts that as the first one. So not time, so you can't have the easy one. Anything else? You want to put your hand up if there's anybody who wants to? Nick.
So quite unusually, and I hadn't come across it before, one colleague in our group said that one of the barriers to pedagogical research, if you were going to offer it to students as an entry-level kind of PEDAR project to get you started as an academic, would be the reluctance of the professional body to allow you to get your students to do a educational research-based project.
Right. Okay. That's yeah. So obviously, a lot of staff may use pedagogical research projects as their final year project, but if your subject discipline doesn't approve that as a project, then it's problematic. Christina.
Very quickly, just to say ethics review, ethics approval, knowing where to start, and actually going through the process, and indeed perhaps even finding a suitable committee depending on the institution. I noticed a colleague posted that earlier on.
Yeah, as it is actually at my own institution where we'd be doing that, it's actually moved around 3 different ethics committees to finally find its local place. So I think experienced that. Sue.
One of the interesting ones we came up with was the types of educational literature that are around. Actually, it's like if you read some of the educational literature, the language used is as someone described, it feels like they've swallowed a thesaurus. You're kind of going, I can't relate to that, and the type of and so that end, he says, if you don't use that language, is ours just as valid? Is it just as correct, or is it not?
Yeah. Alice.
So we talked a bit about people working in silos and all doing their own little thing, and perhaps not realizing initially that what they were doing was either genuinely quite novel and could be something really interesting to others, or that everybody else is doing the same. So, communicating with others more.
Yeah. I didn't finish off in terms of the barriers for my group. Actually, I was following on from what Jane was saying. It's actually in some areas people found it difficult to find a critical friend or a collaborator within their own local course team department. So I think then we went on to enablers research. So actually, an enabler of research is actually to find that community or that, within the own institution or beyond that, to have that critical friend, to have that collaborator. So that nicely leads me on to perhaps if people share, one or two things about what they identified as enablers for pedagogical research. Christina.
Our group had a long conversation, which in part has been mentioned actually, but the value of research projects and also PhD, those particular PhD programs where students are required to go on a placement. So they, they're actually an educational research scholarship project. There were colleagues in the group who'd actually used PhD students as well. It's a great way of getting on top of the literature. It's actually quite sort of time intensive to be able, to have the time to be able to go through the literature. But undergraduate research projects, a good way of doing that. But we also had some conversations about, how well received they are, not always in different departments. So yes, so that's one thing from my group.
Yeah, so it often, that sort of departmental school culture where it's encouraged or supported and recognised is an enabler, isn't it? People feel more, they can dedicate time to that. Yeah. Anybody else? Joe?
Yes, I mean, similarly, we talked about the supportive community around us, but expertise within that community as well. We don't always have people that have got more expertise in pedagogical research that we can go and talk to bounce our ideas off. And also supportive management, that it's okay to try things out and it's okay if they don't work. I think having that freedom to fail is really important and being supported all the way through that. And just having mentors around you until you're confident and familiar enough with these processes yourself to move forward without quite so much support. And then, of course, support others in return.
Yeah. So from our group, we mentioned funding, because actually that can find a time. Often that funding is actually to perhaps support students as researchers, so staff-student partnerships, and I think that seems to help. It's still, requires a lot of time for the academic, but actually sometimes you're sharing the workload, and it's a very pleasurable experience. You're actually training up students to be, doing some of the work as well. Another one from our group was actually benefit from the Open University, where they actually within a faculty they have a sort of centre for scholarship and teaching or pedagogical research, where there's actually expertise and support within a centre, can provide funding, but also other guidance and support, training, so forth. Nick.
So in terms of enablers, somebody from the University of Glasgow mentioned in our group that there are staff-student collaborations which are offered outside of the teaching timetable, so they wouldn't come under professional body strictures. So that's a kind of initiative that we have at Kingston as well, where we have educational research project teams set up between staff and students, and the students get paid. I don't know from the University of Glasgow if the students get paid there, but that's another entry-level way into pedagogical research.
Okay, so thank you for all your contributions. We'll have a look at that Padlet, and I said one thing we're already discussed is actually we perhaps try and use this to, think of, what the network can do to help support that. And as a matter of interest, one of the things we've already thought about as a future seminar is something about, ethical approval, because I think that is something that people do. So, that might well be the next one. But just to also finally say that what I said at the beginning, that these seminars are not only just about, doing pedagogical research, but also hopefully we'll be looking out for some opportunities for people to present what they've done in terms of their pedagogical research. And I think there's some value for us as a community to look at that, not only to see, what, the interesting results and outcomes they got, but I think one thing that's came out of when I've done that in the past is actually seeing the process. So seeing how they refined the research questions, seeing what research methods they used. And I think that might be useful as well. Okay. If there's any questions before we say goodbye, or anything I forgot to say for my committee members? Alice.
Well, I don't know if Jane wanted to come back in on this, but we have put one final question into the Padlet, which is to ask you all, what one action are you going to take after today? So I've just put another link to the Padlet in case anybody missed it. So if everybody wants to spend another minute or two telling us what, if anything, you might take away from today, what you might do differently, what one action. Don't know if Jane wants to say anything more about that.
No, just something for yourself. Don't forget it's anonymous, so it's just something for you to make a note of something you might want to do. I think I'd be encouraging you to look at that first list about what you're passionate about. It looks like you've got lots of overlaps, so I think there's a great start there for your network to think about some things which might be cross-institutional. I know that's revolutionary. Can I just say one thing I want to say is look to each other for your educational inquiry. Don't go thinking that someone else has got this mastered somewhere else in the university. Okay, I really think that lots of people think no one's on home ground with this, and doing good educational research in your subject is your expertise.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because actually follow that, because we talked to our group about, or somebody asked about whether we collaborated with the education department, and that doesn't really happen. And I actually think we might ask when we're talking to other people, it might well be useful to just talk to other scientists, other engineers, rather than people from that discipline. And I think it was interesting. Somebody else's point is the language. I think it was the language people use is almost exclusory. And I remember, reading some papers, everybody starts off with referring to a particular theoretical framework, and I got no background in that. And that I don't think we need to retrain ourselves and all that sort of thing. Our expertise, as Jane nicely said, is our subject, and that's where we need to draw on that. Okay.
Neil, can I jump in really quickly?
Yes.
Sorry. Would it be helpful just to let people know about sharing, because Jane I think mentioned that she'd be happy to share the slides, and we've got the recording. I just wonder if it's helpful to let people know where they can find them.
And where would they find them?
I'm guessing on the website.
Yeah, so why I hesitate there, because I know we've got this Connect site, but that's not a location for it, is it?
No, so I think we'll put them up on the our STEM Horizon website.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll speak to Christina about that. Thanks. So if Jane, if you could forward that, well, I don't know if I got a copy of it, but if we get that,
yeah, I will. Don't worry. Thank you.
Yeah. Could we make a link to the recording on that, Sarah? Would that be?
Yeah, I think that'd be fine. So what we'll do is, following this, when those resources are up on the website, we'll just send another email around the JISC list so that people know that they're there.
Thanks. Francis.
Could I ask a question about choosing a journal to write for? So I'm in chemistry education, and there's chemistry education journals, there's STEM journals, there's wider higher education journals. If I'm doing something maybe to do with peer mentoring and it's applicable beyond chemistry, would you recommend going for a subject-specific discipline journal or something wider?
I can take that if you want, Neil.
Yes, please, Jane.
Yeah. You might want to look at something like the Journal of Learning and Development in Higher Education, if it's got sort of a generic aspect to it, rather than going to the subject specific. So JLDHE, I'll try and find it and put it on the Padlet if you haven't seen it. That's a good one. If you're starting to write in learning and teaching and you haven't written a lot in learning and teaching, there are some journals which are more gentle and more supportive. And so there's one called JPAP, which is a Journal of Professional and Academic Practice. It's run out of, I think, Harriet Watt, and they're very supportive. They're also, one thing I should say is they're also always keen for reviewers. And the best thing that makes you better at writing this stuff is reviewing it. Okay, so get yourself on. Every editor is desperate for reviewers these days, Frances.
Thank you. Is it better to write for a more wider journal or a more specific one if you have that choice, would you say?
I think sometimes it's good to put yourself out of your subject area because it's just sort of make sure that you're kind of getting more impact and reach. Also encourages you to read out of, I said, even if you write for a subject specific, read outside the subject specific journals. Okay, so it depends what some people may need to play a little bit of an internal game about where they write for and what their institution considers counts. So you might have to trade that off a little bit. I know some institutions can be quite fussy. But I think there's great merit in writing in both places.
Thank you very much.
Derek, do you want to come in there?
Yes, I would, if you don't mind me taking 30 seconds, just to remind you that the Society for Natural Sciences is actually sponsoring this event in access to our Zoom account. But what I wanted to say was in relation to what people were talking about is finding colleagues and mentors and so on. The Society does have group projects across different institutions, which people are very welcome to join in and to propose. So we don't have any money, but we do manage to facilitate the joint activities, and we're very happy to talk about mentorship and so on. So contact Sarah if you've got any ideas and want to pursue that.
Thank you, Derek. And hopefully within this network, you know, that we might be able to offer opportunities in that respect as well, sort of going forward, but it's early days. Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm sure everybody's got lots of teaching to go on to this afternoon. So thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you again.
And don't forget to come to Aston next June for Horizons in STEM 2025.
Well said, Alice. We'll start promoting that. We should, yeah.